raising funds, bringing the idea that America has a responsibility to help the victims of a humanitarian disaster happening many, many thousands of miles away. If you'll notice up here, American We Thank You, that's a group of orphans helped by Near East Relief, who were told to organize and make this sort of sign for humanitarian. And we sort of expect, another part of this humanitarian is we expect thanks for it as well. It's not just about an altruism, but we do like our thank yous, and it becomes part of a real a sensibility here. The lecture is really. Let me give you a roadmap of what we're doing here, and if you have questions, we can certainly about my introduction. What I'd like to do in the bulk of this lecture is to first understand the Armenian genocide and the response it solicited in the West with an overview. I'm going to start with an overview. What was it? What happened? Give you a sense of what this thing, the Armenian genocide, was. Then I'm going to move back. I'm going to go back to the 19th century and really describe the origins of this story rooted really in European great power politics. Next, I'll describe the events of the 1915 genocide itself. And then I, of course, will discuss the West's response, mainly the Great Britain and the United States, immediately following the war. So first, I'd like to give you an overview. Are there any questions before I get started going? No? Okay. The genocide, the Armenian genocide, happens under the cover of war. The Jay Winter article you're reading about the genocide in World War I makes this argument. It's important that it happens during World War I, and I think that will become clearer as I continue. World War I itself came to the Ottoman Empire with the British landing at Gallipoli on April 25th, 1915. As you know, the war starts in 1914 in the West, on the Western Front, the Guns of August, 1914, but it doesn't come to the Ottoman Empire, to the east, what some folks call the Eastern Front, until the landing really at Gallipoli on April 25th, 1915. The night before the Allied invasion, the Ottoman government rounded up 250 Armenian intellectuals and cultural leaders in Constantinople, of today modern-day Istanbul, on unnamed charges. And this rounding up of the intelligentsia marked the beginning of the Armenian genocide. They were subsequently taken out of town and massacred. And this becomes a sort of mark of what the genocide happened. This is why the Armenian genocide is commemorated on April 24th, the beginning of these events. Over the remaining course of the war, the Americans, British, and French experienced the Eastern Front through a series of really military and humanitarian disasters. So Gallipoli is a total disaster, right? The genocide is the civilian part of this disaster. It brings in civilians in a new way, and the disaster that becomes the genocide, or the 1915 event, is something that folks on the battlefield are experiencing, but also people at home are experiencing through the media, through reports home. It is something that folks are aware of as it's happening. And I think that has a very powerful impact in terms of the humanitarian rhetoric, in terms of the kind of aid that's put forth, and the kinds of stories that are told about the genocide immediately following the war. The genocide, over 1 million people were killed, civilians were killed. We'll talk about numbers, specific numbers a bit later. Systematic deportations begin after this initial event on April 24th from the interior. The entire Armenian population is eliminated from the interior of Turkey, what is modern-day Turkey. There is a very small Armenian population left in Istanbul today, but they're sort of crypto-Armenians. They're not really... They don't really practice their religion. There's a wonderful book called My Grandmother by a woman who's a human rights lawyer in Turkey who discovered that her grandmother was one of these sort of crypto-Armenians that she grew up with, and she had no idea. And there was this whole sort of group of particularly women who, during the genocide, were kind of raised as Muslims in Istanbul. There also is an Armenian community that identifies as such, but they are... a very quiet community. The assassination of Hrant Dink recently, or a couple of years ago, an Armenian journalist shows sort of the liminal status that Armenians in this world go. My point here is this: is that genocide is highly effective. What it does, and what the genocide did do, was it did serve its purpose. It did eliminate Armenians from this particular region. Genocide, the generation, right? Well, let me show you a map. Where are we talking about? So this is this is modern day Turkey right here, right? The shaded bit here, this is what people consider historic Armenian, where Armenians had traditionally made their homeland, the crossroad of three major bodies of water here. What you see here, this is today. This is current. This is the current Armenian borders. You know, it used to be part of the Soviet Union, and now it's an independent nation. So that's current Armenia. So you know where we are in the world here. What these dots represent are the places where the massacres were most prevalent. And as the dots get smaller, there are fewer people. These are about numbers that they're doing here. These lines here are the deportation routes. These are the concentration camps. These were camps that were set up as holding camps, really not meant to sustain a population at all, these dots here. You'll notice that it's really focused on the eastern part of Turkey, or Anatolia. This part, they call it Anatolia, this whole region. Eastern Anatolia. Why? Well, those, the Vilayets, that's historically where Armenians were concentrated. So it happens in this region for a reason. This is where the Armenians had historically lived, usually mixed populations with Muslim neighbors, Greek neighbors, Assyrian neighbors, but they were predominantly, these areas were predominantly Armenian. Total war. Jay Winter is kind of famous for this notion of total war, of really making historians think about World War I as something different. And I think he's right, that total war, what happens in World War I is different than what happens before. Total war encompasses military action and brings civilians into the conflict in a new way. And most of the way we've talked about total war is on the Western Front. How did people contribute to the war effort at home? How did civilians become involved in the conflict? World War II with the bombings, right? That's probably the most explicit example of how a civilian gets engaged. I'd like us to think about total war in the context of the genocide. This is a moment when civilians on the Eastern Front are brought into this conflict in a new way. And through this genocidal regime of the Ottoman government in 1915, civilians and military personnel are brought in, or military action become part of this conflict. For the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, that's what he was during World War I, victory on the Eastern Front. So the Western Front is going on, and then the wars, of course, fought on two fronts. Victory on the Eastern Front, this area that we're talking about, was really about checking German power. He said, look, if we can knock the Ottomans out of the war, then the Germans will be out of the war. We can really make a break. And so he understood the Eastern Front with that invasion at Gallipoli is really significant, right? At the same time as Churchill is formulating these war plans, there's a sentiment in the public discourse. When you're starting a new front of a war in a democracy, you've got to get people on board. There's a sentiment that's expressed in the press that is incredibly powerful. It isn't necessarily about checking German aggression, though that's part of it. People at home are saying, this is a war that will liberate oppressed minorities. And I want to read you a quotation. This is from the press. This is before the genocide begins. This is how people in Britain are talking about the war in the East. The present war is a war against German militarism and a war of liberation. If it should end in a victory of the Allied powers, it should not merely lead to a freeing of the subject and the oppressed in Europe, but also to the freeing of the nationalities who live under Turkish tyranny in Asia. So the purpose of fighting this war in the East was not just about knocking Germany out or winning the war against Germany, but there was an incredible humanitarian, moral, liberatory, if I may say, component to it that sells the war, if you will, to a British public that had already been sacrificing men on the battlefields of Belgium.